The presidential election in November portends to be a landmark in American history. For the first time in 56 years, the race does not include a sitting president or vice president. So the potential for marked changes in policy are ripe, and this is especially true in the area of foreign policy. The next president will face enormous foreign policy challenges in a time when the faith in tried and true policy approaches has faded and U.S. prestige in the world has waned. He or she will face extraordinary dangers to American peace and security, such as the Iraq War, terrorism, and the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere. The rise of new powers such as China and the restoration of old ones such as Russia will generate many new issues and concerns. But the new president's foreign policy will be broader than these more traditional security concerns. Discontent with the dislocations of increased trade and migration threaten to derail the globalizing economic order, which has benefited so many. Rising energy and food costs not only sow the seeds for conflict throughout the world, but may reverse many of the positive trends in the developing world. And finally, the president must confront the demands for U.S. leadership on global climate and environmental issues. To help us make sense of some or all of these problems, and to suggest ways in which the 2008 elections may or may not be an opportunity for the American public to give its opinion about the way forward, we have assembled a distinguished group of experts to provide their perspectives. Let me briefly introduce them. Directly on my left, we have Joseph S. Nye, Jr., class of '58, the University Distinguished Service Professor at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He's also the Sultan Oman Professor of International Relations and former Dean of the Kennedy School. He received his bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, from Princeton University, where he majored at the Woodrow Wilson School and did his postgraduate work at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship and earned a PhD in political science from Harvard. He has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science and Technology, and in 2004, he published Soft Power, The Means to Success in World Politics. To my far right over here, we have, who will be going second, we have Ambassador Barbara Bodine, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, who is now a Diplomat-in-Residence, a lecturer in public affairs, and the director of the Scholars in the Nation Service Program at the Woodrow Wilson School, where she also teaches courses on the Iraq War and U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East. Ambassador Bodine's over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service were spent primarily on the Arabian Peninsula and the greater Persian Gulf, specifically looking at U.S. bilateral and regional policy, strategic security issues, counterterrorism, governance and reform. Her tour as ambassador to the Republic of Yemen saw enhanced support for democratization and increased security and counterterrorism cooperation, the establishment of a Coast Guard, and the resumption of Fulbright scholarships for Yemeni students. Since leaving the government, Ambassador Bodine has been Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Governance Institute in the Middle East at the Kennedy School, Fellow at the Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership, visiting fellow at MIT Center for International Studies, and she's also taught at UC Santa Barbara. Ambassador Bodine is a graduate of the University of California, Santa Barbara, Phi Beta Kappa magna cum laude, and she is a past regent of the University of California. On my far left, we have Walter B. Slocombe, class of 1963, a member of Kaplan and Drysdale's Washington, D.C. law firm. He focused primarily on civil litigation, defense, trade, and exempt organizations. Mr. Slocombe first joined the firm in 1971 and became a member in 1974. His time at the firm has been interrupted by periods of service in the U.S. Department of Defense, most recently as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 1994 to 2001, and in 2003 as Senior Advisor for National Defense in the Coalition Provisional Authority for Iraq. In 2004, President Bush appointed him to the Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the United States regarding weapons of mass destruction. Mr. Slocombe was awarded the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal on 5 separate occasions, its Joseph Crutzel Award for Distinguished Service in the Pursuit of Peace, and has been named an honorary submariner by the Fleet Submarine Force. His international service has been recognized by awards from the Polish, German, and Korean governments. He's published numerous articles and monographs on tax law and defense policy. And finally, my colleague, Aaron Friedberg, who's professor of politics and international affairs, the author of 2 books, The Weary Titan, Britain and the Experience of Relative Decline, and In the Shadow of the Garrison State, America's Anti-Statism and its Cold War Grand Strategy. His areas of interest include international relations, international security in East Asia, foreign policy, and defense policy. He's been a fellow at the Smithsonian Institute's Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Norwegian Nobel Institute, and Harvard Center for International Affairs. In 2001, too, he was the first holder of the Henry Alfred Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress, and from 2003 to 2005, he served as a Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs in the Office of Vice President Dick Cheney. He is a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on Democracy Promotion and received his PhD from Harvard University. So let me now turn it over to Joe.
Thank you very much, Nolan. It's nice to be back at Princeton, and this is the only place I can think of where you can dress like this and not be regarded as weird. I very carefully put this inside my carry-on luggage yesterday for fear I get kicked off the airplane. In any case, let me say a little bit about starting us in a conversation. I have a distinguished set of colleagues. I'll be very interested in their views, but let me try to start with a big picture. It grows out of a book that I just published that was reviewed in The Economist last week. It's brand new, called The Powers to Lead. And what I argue is that the powers that you need to lead, whether an individual or a country, are what I call hard, soft, and smart. Now, what's power? Power is the ability to affect others to get the outcomes you want. And you do it 3 ways. You can do it through coercion, sticks. You can do it through payments, carrots. Or you can do it by attracting others to get them to want what you want. The better you are at attracting others, the less you have to spend on carrots and sticks. I would argue that we have not been very good at combining our hard and soft power into smart power in the last 8 years. In fact, we've been quite poor at it, if you believe any of the public opinion polls that are taken around the world. That's a contrast to what we've been able to do in the past. If you look at the Cold War, we did combine our hard and soft power into a smart power strategy. Our hard military power deterred Soviet aggression, while our soft power of culture and ideas and legitimacy ate away belief in communism behind the Iron Curtain. So when the Berlin Wall finally went down, it went down not under a barrage of artillery, but under hammers and bulldozers wielded by peoples whose minds had changed. If we're going to succeed in the current struggle that we face, we're going to have to learn again how to use soft power to win hearts and minds. I would argue that we have not done that over the past 8 years. This idea that we need to become a smart power again was the topic of a commission set up by the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown, which I co-chaired with Richard Armitage, who was the Deputy Secretary of State in the first term of the current Bush presidency. The interesting thing about this commission was that it was bipartisan, half Republicans, half Democrats. We had people like Sandra Day O'Connor and Chuck Hagel, General Tony Zinni, a pretty broad range of people. And they came to a common view that we had lost our way and we're no longer exporting hope, but we're exporting fear. That the term global war on terrorism was a disastrous way to frame a foreign policy. Indeed, the British, for what it's worth, have said that this term, global war on terrorism, actually plays into the narrative of the other side, and they've banned its use in Britain. Nonetheless, it's become the central feature for our foreign policy. So this bipartisan commission came to the conclusion that we had to move away from this and moved toward a foreign policy which restored American soft power, restored us as a beacon of hope. When Abu Ghraib replaces the Statue of Liberty as the icon of American foreign policy, we're in trouble. In that sense, we felt that, and remember, this is a bipartisan finding, not a partisan group that came to this conclusion. We felt that a new American foreign policy was going to have to place a lot more emphasis on international alliances and institutions, place a much higher emphasis on economic development that aligns our aspirations with that of the majority of the world, inaugurate such things as a global public health campaign, take a lead on global climate change, not lip service, a real lead, and keep an open international trading system. These were the things we felt were global public goods, where if a larger country didn't take the lead, nobody else would. But if we took the lead, it would be good for us, but good for others as well. That would not only serve our interests, but also enhance our soft power, or our legitimacy internationally. It's interesting how I think this type of approach resonates across the aisle on both Republicans and Democrats. Rich Armitage and I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about a month ago, late April, and the interesting thing was not only that we had a pretty full complement of senators, which is rare in itself, but that on both the Republican and Democratic side, there were no dissents. There was general agreement about this type of approach. Let me say that if you ask, will any of this show up in the campaigns in terms of the next presidency, I think the answer is probably yes. The reason I say that is if you look at the final three that we have running for president, it's a pretty impressive final three. If I look back at the 16 or so who started, I think we're lucky to have come up with the finalists we have. And I think the interesting thing here is that all of them have said things that echo this. If you read John McCain's speech in Los Angeles, for example, or his speech in London when he was in Europe, it echoes a lot of this. Probably not too surprisingly, because Rich Armitage is one of McCain's advisors. If you listen to Barack Obama, who's the probable Democratic nominee, but also Hillary Clinton, who is not counted out yet, I think you'll also hear echoes of the same type of new approach. The real problem the next president is going to have is how do you set this new tone before you become captured by George Bush's legacy? In other words, if you think of the problems that the new president is going to face on January 21st, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, you name it, you can go through the litany. If he, let's assume it's not she at this moment, but if the new president bobbles any of those, drops the ball on any of those, it's going to consume all their political capital and they're going to be finished. I mean, that will define their presidency. So what do they do if there's a general feeling on a bipartisan basis that you need a new tone of exporting hope rather than fear, and yet you're immediately caught up with one of these immediate pressing problems which you can't drop the ball? I think that leads to a real dilemma for the next president. One of the things you can do is to use the period before January 20th to take certain symbolic actions. You can announce the closing Guantanamo. You can announce a listening tour, not talking, a listening tour to Asia, starting in Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing. In other words, indicating you're aware of the rise of Asia, one of the key events of the 21st century, where we've been transfixed with the Middle East. We've largely ignored one of the most important areas. So there's a series of actions I think the new president is going to need to take before he, or possibly she, gets eaten up by Iraq, Iran, and the litany. And if they don't do that, I fear they're going to be unwilling successors to the Bush legacy, and that we will not escape this current dilemma that we're in. But if we're going to restore American soft power, to develop a smart strategy for leadership along the lines of what we had in the Cold War, it's going to take a smart president to act quickly once November 4th is over. Thank you.
Good morning. Given what I understand of the festivities that go on over this weekend, I am pleased and in great admiration that so many people showed up at 9 o'clock in the morning. And you all look reasonably wide awake. A few months ago, here at the Woodrow Wilson School, the Egyptian ambassador Nabil Fahmy gave a talk. It's one of the great delights here is the range of speakers that are available, not just to the students, but to the faculty. And he gave a talk, you know, not surprisingly, on U.S. policy, broader Middle East. And he said something that has really stuck with me over the months. And it was that the United States needs to move from acting like a superpower to acting like a global power. And if you think about that, he wasn't asking us to go away. He wasn't asking us to disengage. He wasn't saying, you know, Yankee, go home. On the contrary, what it really was a call for re-engagement, to reestablish the role that, as Professor Nice said, that we used to play in international politics, but as a global partner with the rest of the world, rather than as a superpower trying to dictate to the rest of the world. And I think that this is going to be the fundamental challenge to the next president, whomever he or she may be, is to move away from what has become almost a narcissistic kind of foreign policy that has characterized our policies and our approaches over the last several years. And this approach has been both very self-defeating, and I think when you're looking at it from our own strategic interest, ultimately a very isolating approach. We are no longer what one former Secretary of State referred to us as the indispensable power, but we have, in a sense, become just simply the unavoidable power. We've developed, to echo something that Professor Naya said, a negative-based foreign policy where we're very clear about what we don't like, who we won't deal with, what we won't do, and then we expect others to fall in behind. Unfortunately, much of the world is just moving on without us. They're tired of waiting for us to engage. They're tired of waiting for us to take the leadership role that we used to take and that many of them would want us to retake. For example, the Israelis, over our objections, are talking to the Syrians. From the Israeli point of view, this is exactly what they should do in their own national interest, and despite our entreaties to the contrary, and despite our own traditional role as a broker, they're talking directly with the Syrians. The Qataris brokered the peace in Lebanon. Iran brokered the ceasefire in Basra. When there was a call for an international conference on Iraq that demanded that Iran and Syria be included if it was going to be meaningful, and we stalled and expressed our objections, the Iraqis simply went ahead and organized such a regional conference and then invited us. On one level, you can say this is good, that other powers are taking the lead in solving regional issues, and this is a good. But when it is being done simply because we have absented ourselves from the process, then I think we need to look at how are we best furthering our own policies. We have become, in a sense, a large boulder in the middle of a stream. They can't move us, they can't dislodge us, they can't replace us, but they're kind of increasingly learning how to just go around us. We have also, and this is part of what I refer to as the narcissism and the negative-based policy, highly militarized our foreign policy. We're down to, and certainly are perceived as having only one arrow in our quiver. I met last year with a group of West Point cadets and Annapolis midshipmen, and I asked them the difference between national security policy and foreign policy. And they twisted themselves into all sorts of semantic and conceptual pretzels until I finally offered them the answer. There isn't one. I also asked them if it would make any sense, since this was largely West Point cadets, to have an army that was made up solely of heavy armor or artillery or even special operations. And they said, oh, no. Well, would it make sense to have a military that's made up solely of the Army? Well, there were 3 midshipmen there, so they had to say, of course not. And on the contrary, jointness in the military has become the mantra for well over 20 years. So then I went back to them and said, well, if national security policy writ large and foreign policy in all of its aspects are really the same issue, why would we use just one tool, the military? So the third point, so what we need to do is re-mandate, re-staff, refund all the other arrows that were in the quiver that we used to use before, as Professor Nye has pointed out. The third point is to recognize that the major security threats that are facing us and our friends and our allies around the world are going to come increasingly from the weak states, not from the powerful. The odds of a major military engagement of the sort that dominated the 20th century, of tanks rolling across the wheat fields of Poland or something, that is pretty much a thing of the past. The failed and the failing, the weak, not the dominant and powerful other, are going to be the fundamental threats that we face. Failed, weak, and failing states incubate many of the transnational threats that we are going to have to cope with and that we are already coping with. The trick is not to wait until they have failed and then invade, occupy, and if we've learned any lessons from Iraq, do it right. The trick is actually to get ahead of the curve and to keep the failing states from actually failing. This is not a role for the military. This is not what the military does. We need a military, we need a strong military, but we need to use it appropriately, and these are not the threats to which a military is the right tool. But this is a role for diplomacy, this is a role for development, this is a role for the broad engagement of the civil agencies of our government, and also two-track diplomacy. It's what was called soft power and has, I think, been much better christened as smart power. These challenges also cannot be addressed unilaterally. They have to be addressed multilaterally. So we need to re-engage, we need to multilateralize, and we need to demilitarize. With that, some of the major foreign policy priorities as I see them, and that I have also heard echoes of in all of the campaigns, in some more than others, is that even if you do devise the very best strategy, you have to have the tools with which to do it. You need a toolbox that is actually full of operating tools, and perhaps because I'm in the middle of renovating a house, I'm thinking in terms of tools and toolboxes. And you also need a clear set of instructions. I am channeling my other part of my life. And from that, I mean, one of the very first things that the new president is going to have to do is to fix the interagency process. Our process is broken. It is very badly broken. And I was a practitioner, I was in the government for 34 years. And while it was never smooth and it was never perfect, it did function. There was a collaborative effort. There was, most of the time, a sense of one government. And while you may be in an interagency meeting battling royal over what were the proper tactics for a particular issue, you might have thought that the person sitting across the table from you was a complete fool. But you never doubted his loyalty, you never doubted his patriotism, and you never doubted that his commitment was to the broader strategy. You just had a different view on tactics. The process doesn't need a new wiring diagram. It is essentially a functioning diagram, wiring diagram. It's just been subverted over the last 7.5 years. And so what we need is a process that is once again transparent, open, and vigorous to debate, dissent, and contrary inconvenient truths. We have to have resources following missions, not missions following resources. I was at a conference many years ago where, as one person put it, we had one agency on steroids and the rest of the government on life support. And that agency was not the State Department. USAID only has 1/16 of the staff that it had at the end of the Cold War. The U.S. State Department, for example, has 6,500 people. That's not 65,000, 6,500 people to do the whole world. We need resources, and right now what has happened is that since there has become this increasing imbalance, more and more missions start to follow the resources. In other words, they're being dumped on our military when the military is already overstretched, rather than going to those agencies and those people who actually have the skill set to do it. So we need to reverse the flow and have, as I said, resources to missions, not missions to resources. Fund, staff, and mandate the civilian agencies across the board. We need to engage not just with our friends and our allies, but with those states and non-states of concern. Engagement is not synonymous with negotiations, which is not the same as concessions, capitulation, and certainly not appeasement. The corollary to this is we have to try to be as inclusive as possible, and I do have some problems with initiative on the table to have a community of democracies. I have a feeling that where you would draw the line on that would be extremely difficult, and you would be, in a sense, almost forcing a reemergence of the non-aligned movement, which we don't remember very fondly. Engage with our friends as partners, talk with them, have two-dimensional dialogues. We have been very good, again, at telling people what they're supposed to do and what we think. We've become the fishmongers of the world, or the fishwives. A little bit more specifically, in the Middle East, Iraq is obviously the most vexing problem. It has become our obsession, and it has driven out almost any of the time, effort, focus to address other issues that are equally pressing in that region and in other regions. Iraq will have to be addressed, absolutely, but we need to broaden the aperture on what we're doing in the region. One of the very first things that I would hope a new president would do would be to restart the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, or to continue the Annapolis talks, whichever way you want to couch it. King Abdullah of Jordan was here a couple of months ago and was virtually begging that it be completed by the end of this administration, not because he really thought it could be done in that amount of time, but we have a very bad habit of doing the Israeli-Palestinian talks at the end of every administration. You know, it's always on the last, it's always the last of the to-do. And what we should do is make it the first of the to-do. Start it early. Maybe not finish it, but get it started. Until we are engaged on that issue and we are engaged as honest brokers, then all the other issues that we are trying to address in the Middle East will be on everyone else's to-do later list. It will also go a great distance to reassure and bolster our friends in what Mawam Washer, the former Jordanian foreign minister, in his new book calls the Arab Center. On Iraq, very briefly, I think we need to read the full canon of St. David of Petraeus. Counterinsurgency doctrine is 20% military and 80% political. We have been doing the 20% political. If you read the manual yourself, it's really not too bad. He puts an awful lot of stock, and in his recent testimony to become the commander of CENTCOM, he talked about the importance of diplomacy, he talked about the importance of politics, he talked about the importance of development. So if we are going to canonize him, we need to read the full book. Finally, how do you make an impact early and actually at very little cost? I would very much reinforce what Professor Nye said. Words are extremely important. We need to change our rhetoric. We need to change how we address the world, how we talk with the world. That is very simple. An inaugural address that reaches out to the rest of the world and says that we are willing to be partners again, that we will be a global power and not just a superpower. That needs to be done early and quickly and sincerely. And as a practical step, what could be done early and easy? And it was interesting, Professor Nye also kind of brought this up. Every administration loses a lot of time in the beginning trying to figure out who's going to be the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary, the Assistant Secretary, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, and all the way down the whole food chain. We do a bigger change in our bureaucracy than most military coups do overseas. And we lose a lot of time. We lose a lot of time with this. In the interim, while an administration is putting itself together, appoint special envoys, one for each region. This would not be the Assistant Secretary in waiting. This would be someone who is above that, beyond that, a wise man and wise women, who would be sent out as the personal representatives to every major region to be in this listening mode, also a talking mode, to both explain what is the new intent, the new philosophy, the new concepts, the new vision of the administration, to listen to what the concerns are. A lot of our friends and our allies believe they have not been listened to at all for the last several years. Listen, just simply listen. Also explain, also talk, have a dialogue, and even maybe find some expressions of support and assistance. All of this would begin to put some substance behind what I hope to hear in the inaugural address. I'm not naive enough to believe that just nice words and cooing sounds are going to rebuild our position in the world, are going to rebuild our lost credibility or our influence, or that nice words and the most talented diplomats out there, or scholars, are sufficient. But I think it would be critically important that we find some way to signal very early on that there is a change and that there will be substance coming behind it, and then just as critical to follow up. Thank you.
It's Ambassador Bodine stole my line about getting up early in the morning. It is impressive that you've all come, and it's an honor for me to be on this panel, particularly with two very distinguished public servants who I've had the opportunity to work with earlier on. One of the requirements of the Defense Department is that all new policies have three abstract nouns to describe them: dissuade, deter, defeat, for example. I think a good three-word summary of the tasks that will face the new president are rebuild, resolve, and confront. I largely agree with what's been said about the disastrous effects of the last 7.5 years on our reputation. A wise person said that Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib are self-inflicted asymmetric attacks on the United States. And we have also managed to forfeit our reputation for effectiveness. There are reasons for that, not all of which are our fault, but it's true. Our military is overstretched, and it faces a serious budgetary problem. We have essentially been financing the military at a totally unsustainable level, even leaving aside the $100 billion or so in supplementals for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The increases have been, in real terms, something like 10% a year, and that simply can't go on, and it will force very difficult choices as to what to spend money on and what not to. The sheer scale of the American military is quite remarkable. Obama proposes to increase the Army and the Marine Corps by a size such that the increase would be larger than the entire British Army. The United States probably spends as much on defense as the rest of the world put together, especially if you leave out the actual personnel costs, which are very hard to calculate across the board. But even so, we face very serious issues as to how to allocate our defense resources and what to prepare for it. We also suffer from a truly poisonous political culture in the United States. The sense, in some sense, the point that Ambassador Bodine made about the sense that the people from the State Department are not your enemy. We are, after all, sort of on the same side. Is much worse in terms of the politics, and you know, and it isn't all from the Republicans. Some of it is from the Democrats, and some of it is retaliatory poisonousness. And I think it will be a real challenge. Fortunately, in their different ways, both Senator McCain and Senator Obama, to some degree, symbolize an effort at a more cohesive approach to problems, and I think that's a good thing. So that's rebuilding. resolving, any president is going to face a series of hard problems that come up and simply have to be dealt with. It's one of the problems about government is that a lot of it is the sort of tyranny of the inbox, which has now become the tyranny of the thousands of emails which arrive each day. I want to talk about Iraq in a little more detail, but there's a whole series: North Korea, trade issues, Iran, and one thing you can be reasonably certain of is that as we look back 5 years from now on either the first McCain term or the first Obama term, there will be problems which none of us expected would come up, and they will absorb huge shares of the government's time. But then there are the issues of confronting longer-term problems. I agree that the definition of American foreign policy as essentially a fight against terrorism is a fundamental conceptual mistake which misconceives both the nature of the terrorist threat and the nature of our real problems. Non-proliferation, the very real risk that 5 years from now there will be at least one more country having conducted a nuclear test and others well along the way is very high. It's not inevitable. We may be able to prevent it, but it's a fundamental problem. And then there are other problems of climate change and energy and so on, and migration. Also, I think an issue which gets rather less attention in this country than in Europe is the profound and unfortunate changes that are taking place in Russia. That Russia is reverting to a traditional pattern of highly autocratic. No one should misconceive Putin and Medvedev as Stalin or even Khrushchev, but it is a very different Russia from the one that even 5 years ago we hoped would come up. And I guess the best symbol of this is a story I was told by somebody who was in the room. I wasn't, but somebody was, who told me. President Clinton and Putin had a summit in June of 2000, and one of the traditions in a summit is that on the last day there's a sort of laundry list of intractable problems, usually pretty minor, that haven't been resolved, and the president is wound up to faithfully go through his talking points. And so the Russians had arrested an American businessman on spying charges, and we'd been trying to get him out, and President Clinton agreed to raise this issue. So with just him and Putin in the room and an interpreter and a note taker, he said, you know, you've arrested Mr. Smith, and he's an American businessman, and the problem is hurting our relations. Putin looked at him and he said, your Mr. Smith is an intelligence operator. I used to be an intelligence operator. Sometimes people in our business get caught. What's your next issue? And I think that's a pretty good summary of what the system has become. But it is going to raise issues. And of course, China is a fundamental issue. And from the point of view of defense planning, I agree broadly that the odds are that our future conflicts will be more like the war in Iraq or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan than like the trench warfare of the First World War. But I think there is inevitably a danger. You know, the definition of military science is the application of those principles which, if applied, might have won the previous war and will almost certainly lose the next one. There is a danger that we will prepare for what we sort of wish. We will have the army we wished we'd had, to paraphrase a distinguished alumnus of this institution. We will end up with the army we wished we'd had for Iraq, not the army we wish we would have for the next war. And that indeed will be a big resource issue, because it is essentially a conflict between the preparation for low-end operations and the preparation for very high-tech, highly intense operations. And that also tends to be the fight between the Army and the Marine Corps on the one side and the Navy and the Air Force on the other. Let me say just a few words about Iraq, because I think in terms of the practical issues that a president will have to face, it's the most immediate. And I think the problem is that the situation in Iraq in 6 months from now will neither be good enough nor bad enough for the solution to be easy. If things were much better, then I think it's likely they will be. Even a Democratic president could say, well, happily I was wrong. I never wanted this to be a disaster. And we can take a look at it, and it looks like things are going better. And a Republican, McCain, would be able to say, see, I told you if you did it right, it would be right. A little bit more push, and it'll be okay. And conversely, if things were terrible, even a Republican administration could say at some point the game is no longer worth the candle and you deal with what's the reality. I think the problem is going to be that the situation is not going to be a whole lot different from what it is now. That is, some real improvements in security. You can ask whether they've been bought at a long-term price, but some real improvements in security, but very minimal progress on the political issue. I believe the war in Iraq is fundamentally a fight about who within Iraq is going to hold power. It's not about terrorism, it's not about Al-Qaeda, it's not really about people not liking to be occupied by the Americans. Not that there aren't terrorists in Al-Qaeda and that people don't like the occupation, but the fight is about power in Iraq. And I don't see that we're making a heck of a lot of progress on that issue. So that in a sense, whoever it is will find that their campaign rhetoric about no surrender or setting a deadline, what amounts to a deadline or schedule for withdrawal, encounters some very real difficulties. The other issue that I want to kind of highlight is something that's going to be on the horizon is nuclear weapons policy. It's now essentially 15 years since the end of the Cold War, longer. I assume it is still true. At 5 o'clock every night, and I went down and watched once, we do a simulation to make, which we probably need to do, we do a simulation of a Soviet attack a nuclear attack on the United States to make sure the comms are working and so on. But we also maintain a force which is largely patterned on what was required for the Cold War. Now, if you take the most gloomy possible estimate of what's going to happen with Russia and China, that may be even the right answer. But I don't think we have thought through the question of what nuclear weapons are for in the coming years in terms of our own requirements, in terms of the impact of our decisions about nuclear weapons on the chances for arms control and on the chances for further continuing to hold the line as well as we have on proliferation. And I think that's going to be a major issue, and it transcends question to whether you're for the reliable replacement warhead is a very difficult question to answer unless you have some sense what nuclear weapons are for. So I think those are going to be two of the long-term issues that are going to have to be faced in terms of the defense program. Thank you.
Well, let me join in welcoming you here as a member of the faculty, not a Princeton graduate, as you can tell. I don't have the orange and black.
That's why you and I are on this side.
I guess that's right. I'm always impressed not only by the infinite array of combinations of orange and black that are in fact possible, but also by how engaged people are, how many people come back, how interested they are in serious discussion, even on 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. So as a member of the faculty, I want to thank you. I think that's critically important. It's one of the things that makes Princeton a great institution, and I hope 20 years from now, perhaps I'll see some of your sons and daughters wearing orange and black and coming back for reunions. I want to make 3 points and do it fairly briefly. The first is the most obvious one. Whoever is elected president in November is going to have his or her hands very full. It's always the case that a new administration inherits problems from the previous administration. That will be even more the case here because of the severity and intensity of the issues with which we're currently dealing and will be dealing 6, 8 months from now. And in addition, as Walt Slocombe pointed out, it's important to remember that things will happen that no one anticipates right now, which could greatly change the way we view the world, the priorities that we have, and so on. After all, in November of 2000 or January of 2001, no one anticipated the kind of world that we've quickly found ourselves in and still are in today. I think the next administration is going to have to deal with a set of immediate issues, and to the extent that it's able, has the energy and the time, it is also going to have to address, or it will have to make time to address some longer-term issues, which in some ways have been deferred over the last few years. The first set of issues, obviously, is Iraq and also Afghanistan, which we haven't mentioned thus far, which clearly are going to dominate the agenda, at least in the opening months and opening years, no doubt, of the next administration. Secondly is the problem of proliferation, nuclear proliferation in particular. This is not only, of course, a long-range problem, although it is very much, but it looks as if the next administration will inherit a situation in which two critical cases have not yet been resolved. Both Iran, clearly, where Iranian efforts to develop the technologies necessary to build nuclear weapons seem to be going forward, despite efforts sustained over a long period of time to stop them. And in the case of North Korea, where, although there are some signs of potential progress, at least it's unlikely, I think, that there will be any final resolution of that problem before the next administration is in power. And these two cases are going to make a huge difference. It is possible, if one wants to be optimistic for a moment, to imagine that, in fact, we will be successful the next several years in drawing North Korea back over the nuclear line and preventing Iran from crossing it, in which case I would argue the prospects for controlling future proliferation, although they will not be, it will not be easy to do that, will be much better than they will be if, in fact, we fail in both regards. And North Korea remains a nuclear power and Iran becomes one. So we're at a tipping point on that issue, and the next couple of years will be crucial. The problem of terrorism, particularly looking past Iraq and thinking about the longer term, the severity of that problem, the ways in which we assess the threat. I think there is now a kind of not fully open discussion about whether the problem is still as serious as some people believed it was a few years ago, whether in fact it may be becoming more so, even though we don't necessarily see the signs of that at the moment. And there are many different aspects to this problem, generally two categories. One is, how do you deal with preventing near-term threats through the use of intelligence, police cooperation, military action, and so on, but also how do you deal with the longer-term sources and causes that are feeding the terrorist movements that we confront today. And I think both of those issues will be open to discussion and will be unresolved and will have to be debated by a new administration. So that's plenty. That will probably eat up 75% of the time of the people in the next administration responsible for foreign policy and national security. Like it or not, I think that's probably going to be true. But there are some enormous longer-term issues which also need to be dealt with, and we've touched on them here. Let me just say a few words about them. The first is the question of the changing structure of the international system, and in particular the changes in the distribution of international power that are underway and which in many respects have accelerated over the last quarter century. People generally refer to this as the rise of Asia, and I think that's not a bad bumper sticker description, but we're talking here both about the growth of Chinese power and the possible implications of that, both positive and negative, potentially, from the perspective of the United States, and also the increasing emergence of India as a major player on the world stage, both economically and strategically, with, again, potential benefits for the United States if we handle that relationship properly, but also some challenges and problems as well. In this category of emerging or re-emerging powers, I would also put Russia. And here I agree with what's been said, that unfortunately, contrary to what many people hoped and believed 10 or 15 years ago, what we seem to be facing, at least in the near to medium term, is a country which is better off than it was, in part because of the increased price of oil, and ruled by a regime that has concentrated power in its own hands, that seems intent on reasserting Russia as a major power, and which doesn't yet have a fully formed vision of how it's going to do that, but at least for the moment seems to be choosing methods which are involve confrontation with the West. And that's going to be a major problem. I think it will also be a source potentially of increasing cooperation or renewed cooperation between the United States and Europe. One of the reasons why there has been tension and drift in the transatlantic relationship is not only differences over how to deal with current issues like Iraq, but also, at least for a while, the absence of an external threat which in the past, during the Cold War, forced the United States and Europe together. Unfortunately, Russia seems likely to pose a challenge, if not the same kind of threat the Soviet Union did, but this may have some benefits in terms of the relationship between the United States and its European allies. Further out, both in time and I suppose also for the time being in priority, is a whole set of what, for lack of a better term, one might call global issues, which I think are now acknowledged in a way that they might not have been a few years ago by people across the political spectrum as urgent and requiring coordinated attention, not only from the U.S. government, but in collaboration with other governments around the world. The problem of climate change, emerging diseases, issues of energy security, migration, and so on. These are clearly important and will be significant foreign policy and national security challenges. So that's point number one. Whoever wants this job, good luck to them. Point number two is there will be some differences in the ways that a McCain administration on the one hand, or an Obama or a Clinton administration on the other would deal with these problems. Of course, you can't ever prove that because one or the other, or one of the three is going to get in there. We won't know what the others would have done. But I think there will be some differences. I should say, though, at the outset, that there are some very important similarities which are we're so used to that we tend not to note them, and they're important and deserve to be pointed out. One of which is that of these three candidates, all are what I would call internationalists. All are people who favor continuing American engagement in the world, people who believe in the importance and possibility of America's playing a leadership role, and so on. There is no one on that roster who has any touch of isolationism or expresses any desire to see the United States draw back from the world. That's perhaps not surprising, given the state of thinking in our political parties and the elites that surround those parties. But it is somewhat surprising in light of what we've been through in the last, say, 15 years, in the last 8 years. Many people expected that after the end of the Cold War, the United States would have lost its reason for being as engaged as it was in the world and would draw back. That didn't happen. Some people have anticipated that the problems of terrorism and the friction that the United States has experienced with other countries, even friendly countries, in the last few years, would also feed isolationist sentiments. And there is some of that. If you look at public opinion polls, the numbers of people who say we would be better off if we minded our own business, which is the sort of standard question that's been asked for 30 or 40 years, is now up about where it was at the end of Vietnam. So there is some inclination on the part of the public generally to want to draw back, and it's not surprising. And I think one of the questions looking forward is how those forces will play out. Will they grow? Will they become an active influence in American policy, or will they fade away as they've done in the past, even when people anticipated that they might grow? So all are internationalists. There will be differences in the ways that they will deal with Iraq, although, as has been suggested, the differences in rhetoric may be greater than the differences in policy, at least in the initial stages of a new administration. Senator Obama may make declarations about his intent to withdraw U.S. forces and may be able to follow through on those to some degree, but if the strategic situation, the security situation in Iraq seems to deteriorate, as a result, he'll be under pressure not to move too quickly. On the other hand, Senator McCain may, as he intends to do, follow through on his commitment to maintaining U.S. forces and seeing through the surge and so on. But if the situation deteriorates and seems to be spiraling out of control, he too will come under pressure, this time I think pressure from the other direction, to pull back. So there's likely a window, a period in which the policies will be rather similar, and the question will be how they evolve over time. There may be differences in the ways in which the McCain and Obama administration would deal with some of the proliferation problems that we currently face. Senator McCain, in a recent speech, staked out a position which, to some extent, is taking a harder line than the current administration, referring to the initial position of the Bush administration on these negotiations, demanding the so-called complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. And some people have said the current administration has moved away from that, is willing to accept the possibility that North Korea retains some nuclear capabilities in order to get rid of the majority of them. Regarding Iran, I think the question will be between different kinds of administrations, what mix of pressure on the one hand and dialogue on the other will be pursued to try to resolve that question. There may be some differences in the way a Democratic and a Republican administration would approach the great powers, the re-emerging and emerging great powers. Certainly Senator McCain has staked out a pretty tough position, at least rhetorically, as regards Russia, although he hasn't said that much about China. There may be differences also on trade. In the Democratic Party and to some extent in the Republican Party, there is growing pressure for protectionist measures of one kind or another, and there may be some differences in the inclination of a Republican and a Democratic administration to follow through, for example, on some of the free trade agreements that are under negotiation, particularly the one with South Korea, to which there is now significant opposition in the Congress. So that's number two. There will be differences. Number three, and it's the final point I want to make, is that these differences in policy stem from deep causes. And despite the way in which we're likely to hear these issues discussed in a campaign season where one side will say the other is simply naive and lacks experience and doesn't understand the world, and the other side will say in turn, you're just bloody-minded, want to throw America's weight around and use force and so on. There will be a lot of rhetoric, as we come to expect, but there are underlying differences, and I think they're serious and I would say legitimate differences in view about how the world works. And I would characterize them very crudely as follows. I think among, or at least at the sort of the core of the Democratic Party, there is a deep belief, which I would describe as a liberal belief, in the possibility of a harmony of interests among powers, regardless of the character of their regime, regardless of their ideology. And that's the reason why there is such an emphasis on dialogue, and also why there is such an emphasis on the possibility of multilateral institutions to promote contact, communication, and cooperation. Those are instruments, mechanisms for discovering those areas where the interests of the United States, for example, in Iran, or the United States and China, or the United States and Russia overlap. I would say at the core of the Republican Party view of foreign policy, and again this is gross oversimplification, is what I would describe as a somewhat conservative skepticism about the possibility of achieving this harmony of interests, which is rooted in some beliefs about the character of different kinds of political regimes. And to put it crudely, it's a belief that relationships between democracies are fundamentally different than relationships between democratic and non-democratic powers, and that some non-democratic regimes, at least, cannot be effectively engaged, that there is no overlap of interests, or it's very small, and it may not be possible to achieve a greater agreement. At least it may not be possible to do so without the presence and potentially the threat or use of American power in order to achieve that. So I think it's worth remembering that even when people disagree deeply about these kinds of questions, as they inevitably do, there are often serious reasons why they do so, and it's not just a problem of the other person being misguided or evil or stupid.
But says 10:30, but I can't believe it.
Okay, great. This has been terrific. We now have some time for questions. I would facilitate things if you could come down and line up at the microphones. That way everyone can hear. Oh. Make sure, yeah, it may need to be turned on.
Okay.
Would you recommend the next president continue with the missile defense system in Czechoslovakia? Okay, the question is whether or not the next president should continue with the missile defense system in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Walt.
The short answer, I think, is yes. I think the central reason for that is if, like me, you are skeptical that we will be able to persuade Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions, and like me, you are not attracted to the idea of using military force in what I think would be a futile attempt to stop them, it's good to have some other alternatives in addition to traditional deterrence. And one of the advantages of a missile defense system is that it would provide some, and I think some quite substantial protection against the kind of attack that Iran might be able to launch in the next couple of decades. And for a variety of reasons, it's important that that protection extend to our allies as well as to the territory of the United States. That's basically the argument for having it in Europe as well as in the United States. Whether the Polish government, and I think as soon as an administration decides to go forward with it, the issues with the Polish government will be resolved, and we should be forthcoming in resolving them. The Russian objections, I think, are 99% political and opportunistic, and I find it hard to I think one of the things which the administration belatedly has done wisely is to make very far-reaching proposals with the Russians that address all of their legitimate concerns. There's a lot more to be said on that issue, but that's my view.
I agree completely with what's been said. Just to add a small footnote, it seems to me that missile defenses of various kinds may make more sense, do make more sense in a world where we are dealing with smaller powers with smaller and less sophisticated nuclear arsenals than during the Cold War, than they may have made when we were up against the Soviet Union with tens of thousands of ballistic missiles. Yeah. Relatively limited capability can be very effective against a country which only has a few dozen.
I should have said that missile defense against the Soviet Union was a fantasy. Missile defense against a small attack is actually quite not a fantasy.
Terrific. Yes.
The question is resources. Attorney General Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General, said, "Watch what we do, not what we say." Joe Nye has put forward the concept of smart power and has given it some real legs. The facts are that the U.S. budget this year will spend approximately 1/3 of $3 trillion on its defense, diplomacy, foreign affairs, 050150 budgets. Of that amount, 93%, over $900 billion, is spent on the Pentagon if you add in some military programs such as nuclear weapons, veterans benefits, and the cost of the money. The intelligence cost is $60 billion. The State Department, USAID, Voice of America, everything else is $36 billion. That's a ratio of 93 to 6 to 1. How do we do soft power when we are faced with such a wide disparity in the resource base in the U.S. budget process? And that is not going to change. The military wants another $300 billion to rebuild the military forces. Thank you.
It's worth looking at the statement made by Secretary of Defense Bob Gates last November in Kansas, in which he said it's a bit odd when you are spending, he used the term $500 billion because he wasn't including a lot of the things you mentioned, $500 billion for defense or the Pentagon and $36 billion for everything else. And he said, I think we absolutely have to spend more on our soft power. And then he followed that up by saying it's a bit odd when the Secretary of Defense asks for more money for the State Department. It's a little bit like man biting dog in Gates's terms. But he said these are odd times. So I would say that your comment is amply supported by the Secretary of Defense.
Ambassador Bodine, if I understood our conversation yesterday after the session, you believe that precipitous withdrawal from Iraq would be bad, but that we should get out within 24 months. Is that a timetable that you would announce, and could you elaborate on what you think, we should do there? Thank you.
Yeah, I've got 5 minutes. I will solve Iraq.
Less than 5 minutes.
Huh?
Less than 5 minutes.
Less than 5 minutes. Okay. I would say that we are going to be leaving Iraq. At some point, I don't buy, and I do think that Senator McCain has been misquoted on his 100-year mark. Unfortunately, that's what people have heard. Since we are, we have come to the point where we recognize that we are not going to be there forever, and the Iraqis do not wish us to be there forever. And I believe that the surge, while it has made some major improvements on the security side, has limited impact going forward on stability, on reconciliation, accommodation, the political side. That it behooves us to think in terms of a reasonable planning process to pull our forces out of there. I would change the dialogue, however, from one on how quickly we withdraw our troops to how smartly we transition our presence and our relationship in Iraq from one that is military-centric and security-centric to one that is political development and stability-centric. And as you go through that transition, and it will be forcing the Iraqis to pick up more, and I believe that at root they can do it, then the numbers will start to come down. The idea of a precipitous withdrawal is wrong, and both candidates and a number of people in the region have made the point that we should leave far more smartly and with far greater planning and consultation with the Iraqis and the neighbors than we went in. Whether that is 24 months or 18 months, I think that it would be, ill-advised to be setting dates like that right now from this table. But I do think we should be planning on this transition. There is, I will say, one step that is already been begun in Iraq that I think can be the seeds for this kind of a transition. And these are the provincial reconstruction teams, which are a triumvirate of the military on the security side, diplomats doing governance and all of that, and development people doing sustainable development. And using those as the seeds or the models to move forward on that kind of a transition. And then if you want that kind of a shift from military-centric to political-centric.
I apologize because we don't want to go up against President Tillman's address. We're going to have time for just one more question.
I have a two-part question. One is, in our attempt for a softer approach or in winning people's hearts and minds and influencing U.S. foreign policy, do you see a role for American Muslims and Arab Americans in helping to steer the U.S. foreign policy, and if so, how? That's my first question. And then my second question is, in terms of our attempts to be an honest kind of broker of the Middle East process, would you envision a one-state solution at all as a potential way out?
On the one-state solution, two-state solution, I think we are going to have a two-state solution. I really don't see a one-state solution. I would also then throw in the obvious caveat that it's not our decision to make. But I think a two-state solution is probably where we will come out, as almost all observers note that the outlines of a final settlement have been there for a long time. The role of Arab Americans and others in doing this rebuilding, absolutely. I don't think that we should be sort of plunking the ball over to that court. It's something that all Americans need to be involved in. I would like to see in all of our policy, official policy, two-track diplomacy, you know, the diversity of the United States brought to bear. But this is an issue that is a national security issue. And I would like to see all the tools used, but not sort of, I've never been one in the Foreign Service that we send African Americans to Africa, Hispanics to Latin America, you know, on and on. These are national issues.
Terrific. Thank you.